The view screen showed 30 warships descending toward Earth, their commander broadcasting surrender in every language. They expected fear, compliance, weakness. What they got was a global chorus of defiance, raw footage of resistance, and one human asking if it was viral marketing for a movie. This is the story of how humanity's arrogance met ours, and lost. Commander Verax's fleet emerged from jump space in a perfect killing formation. 30 warships materialized in high orbit, positioning themselves with geometric precision above Earth's night side. The Graxian strategy was never subtle. Shock, awe, immediate capitulation. Their doctrine was a blunt instrument, and Earth was the next target on the list. The first action was a calculated display of power. They didn't fire on cities. They didn't target military bases. Instead, they systematically eliminated every satellite in orbit. One by one, communication relays, GPS networks, and observation platforms vanished from the scopes in silent, precise bursts of energy. It was a surgical strike against the planet's nervous system. On the command deck, officers watched the tactical displays. Earth's fragmented communication networks lit up like a panicked nervous system. 1,000 signals flared across the planet. Military channels, civilian bands, emergency frequencies. It was chaos, a disordered, multi-voiced uproar. This wasn't the unified planetary defense they had anticipated. It was noise, uncontrolled, unpredictable, and deeply confusing. They leaned into their consoles, waiting for the silence that always followed such a demonstration. The quiet terror, the broken transmission from a central authority begging for terms. Instead, the cacophony continued. Then came the broadcast, their surrender demand, transmitted across every frequency in every known human language, a simple, unequivocal command to yield. The first response wasn't from a government. It wasn't from a general. It was a shaky, low-resolution video feed from a city rooftop. A single human stood silhouetted against the alien fleet, holding a device up to the sky. The audio was raw, unfiltered. "Dude," the voice said, filled with genuine curiosity rather than fear. "Your CGI is amazing." On the Graxian command deck, the officers exchanged looks. This was not in the projection models. This was not how a species on the brink of extinction was supposed to react. The call to adventure had been issued, the classic demand for surrender, the moment of choice. But humanity in its entirety seemed to be refusing it. They weren't meeting the dragon with fear. They were meeting it with something far more dangerous. Bewildered, almost insulting curiosity. The script was already off the page, then the noise stopped. Not the panic, not the activity, just the noise. The 1,000 fractured signals and panicked transmissions suddenly aligned, coalescing into one clean channel. The chaos resolved. On the main view screen, a new feed appeared, sharp and stable. A woman sat at a simple desk, hands resting calmly on its surface. Dr. Eleanor Patel. No flag behind her, no military insignia. Just a person, looking directly into the lens as if she'd been waiting for this call. She didn't represent a single nation. The identifier at the bottom of the screen read, Earth Emergency Response Coalition. It was an entity with no record in the Graxian databases, a name that hadn't appeared in any of their intelligence briefings. It wasn't the United Nations. It wasn't a superpowers emergency council. It was something new, formed in the minutes after their arrival, and it was already broadcasting on a secured, planet-wide frequency. Her voice was level, a contrast to the bedlam they had just witnessed. There was no tremor, no hesitation. It was the voice of someone stating a simple, inconvenient fact. "You are mistaken," she began, her tone devoid of the manufactured panic they had engineered their arrival to create. "You believe you are offering us a choice." She paused, letting the words hang in the silent command deck. The assumption behind their entire operation, the ultimatum, the display of force, was being dismissed in a single sentence. Then she delivered the core of it. "Humans don't surrender. Not to storms, not to disease, not to each other, and certainly not to you." It wasn't a boast. It wasn't a threat. It was a declaration of a fundamental, species-wide truth, delivered with the flat certainty of a physicist stating a law of nature. The statement was absolute. It admitted no debate, no negotiation. It simply was. On the Graxian command deck, the mood shifted. The arrogance that had fueled their descent began to curdle into something else. A flicker of doubt. This was not in the projections. Their entire strategy was predicated on political fracture. on exploiting the ancient divisions their intelligence reports had so thoroughly documented. They had maps of every border dispute, every historical grievance, every ideological rift. They had planned for a planet that would break along its well-worn seams. They had not planned for a philosophical united front. They had not planned for a species to discover a single unifying purpose in the face of annihilation. The woman on the screen was not pleading for mercy or bargaining for terms. She was informing them of a reality they had failed to comprehend. The refusal of the call was complete. The demand for surrender had been issued, and Earth as a single entity had rejected it. Humanity had collectively, and without a single centralized command, stepped across the threshold into the special world of total war. The rules had just changed, and the Graxians were no longer holding the book. The Graxian playbook was built on one fundamental error. They assumed terror would fracture humanity's fragile political landscape. Their intelligence files were thorough, detailed, immaculate. They chronicled centuries of human conflict, division, and petty nationalism. They had maps of every old war, charts of every trade dispute, psychological profiles of every major leader's personal grudges. They knew how humans fought each other. They assumed that when faced with a greater external threat, those old fractures would split wide open. Chaos would reign. Systems would fail. Surrender would come from a dozen competing governments, each begging for separate terms. They had no file for humanity's secret weapon. It wasn't a device. It wasn't a superweapon. It was a global culture of rehearsal. For generations, humans had consumed stories of this exact scenario. Books, films, games, entire genres dedicated to the end of the world, to alien invasion, to first contact gone horribly wrong. They hadn't just imagined it. They had drilled for it in their minds. They had lived through it 1,000 times in fiction. They knew the tropes. They recognized the play. So when the Graxians arrived with their warships and their ultimatums, citizens didn't wait for government memos. They knew what to do. They knew where the old fallout shelters were because they'd seen them in movies. They knew how to form impromptu militias because they'd read about it in novels. They knew to avoid mass panic, to establish local communication networks, to scavenge and adapt because these were the lessons of 1,000 apocalyptic stories. The population was already pre-briefed. They had done the homework before the test was even assigned. The Graxians tried to break a culture that had already broken itself 1,000 times in its own imagination and had chosen, each time, to prepare. Their intimidation tactics were not new. They were cliché. The giant ships hovering over cities, the destruction of satellites, the demand for surrender. Humanity had seen this episode before. They knew how it was supposed to go. And they had collectively decided long ago that they didn't like the ending. So they wrote a new one. On the Graxian command deck, the confusion was palpable. The psychological warfare units reported a complete failure of their primary metrics. Fear spikes were inconsistent. Panic was localized and short-lived. The expected societal collapse was replaced by a grim, determined mobilization. The aliens watched as humans responded not like a terrified herd, but like a community that had just seen a familiar disaster plan put into action. They were following a script, but it was a script the Graxians had never read. The resolution was a total strategic failure for the invaders. They had completely misunderstood human psychology. They saw centuries of conflict and mistook it for inherent weakness. They saw cultural preparation and mistook it for paranoia. They saw resilience and mistook it for fragility. Their entire doctrine, which had subjugated a dozen species across the galaxy, was based on a premise that simply did not apply to Earth. They came expecting to shock a primitive species into submission. Instead, they challenged a species that had been stress testing its own extinction for fun and found it was ready. The Graxians moved to their next play. An electromagnetic pulse followed by a full-spectrum information warfare assault. The strategy was clear. Plunge the planet into a technological dark age. Sever command from control. Silence the unified voice that had so unnerved them. They would turn Earth's own infrastructure against it, using the very networks of communication as a weapon to induce chaos and isolation. The pulse washed over the planet. A silent, invisible wave of energy. On the Graxian tactical displays, the lights went out. Vast sections of the global network blinked off. Cities dimmed. Data streams dissolved into static. For a moment, it looked like textbook success. A planet going quiet under the weight of its own disabled technology. Then the displays began to flicker back to life. Not all of them. Not the civilian grids or the open networks. But new signals appeared. Hardened military frequencies, shielded and redundant, activated as designed. That was expected. Standard procedure for any species with a basic defense program. But then other signals emerged. Signals they couldn't classify. Ham radios crackled to life. Not in ones or twos, but in thousands. A wave of analog static filled frequencies the Graxians had considered worthless. Pre-fiber optic copper landlines long abandoned, hummed with renewed activity. Runners carrying physical messages moved through streets where digital networks had failed. The planet's response was a hybrid beast. Part cutting-edge digital, part primitive analog. It wasn't a seamless network. It was a patchwork, a chaotic, overlapping mess of different systems and eras all working at once. This technological heterogeneity, which Graxian intelligence had listed as a critical weakness, a sign of a divided, inefficient species, became its armor. Their sophisticated jamming algorithms were designed to disrupt clean, centralized digital systems. They could break encryption, hijack satellites, overwhelm servers. They were useless against a handwritten note carried by a teenager on a bicycle. They were blind to a message transmitted by a series of flags on a rooftop. They could not parse a coordinated attack signaled by the ringing of church bells across a valley. They hadn't crippled Earth. They had forced it to adapt. And it adapted downward, shedding its complex digital skin for a tougher, simpler, and far more resilient skeleton. The planet became harder to see, harder to map, harder to hit. Their sensors were built to track energy signatures, data packets, wireless traffic. They couldn't get a lock on a society that could instantly downgrade its own tech level, falling back on systems that were centuries old, but utterly reliable. The command deck was silent. The officers watched their displays flicker with the ghost of a planet that was refusing to die. Their own systems were optimized, uniform, and incredibly vulnerable to a targeted attack on that uniformity. Earth systems were a chaotic jumble. There was no single point of failure. To kill it, you would have to break every radio, cut every wire, stop every runner, and silence every bell. It was a logistical impossibility. The resolution was a complete inversion of their plan. Earth's greatest perceived vulnerability, its fragmented, non-standardized, and archaic tech base, had become its primary strategic advantage. The EMP was meant to be the kill shot. It turned out to be the thing that made the target disappear into the static of its own history. The Graxians were left staring at a screens, trying to fight a war against an enemy that had just willingly stepped back in time to win it. Orbital superiority meant nothing if you couldn't hold the ground. The bombardment had failed to break their will. The EMP had failed to silence them. The only option left was boots on the pavement. Graxian dropships descended from the clouds, piercing the atmosphere in precise, threatening formations. They targeted the major population centers, the nerves of the planet: New York, Shanghai, Moscow. The plan was simple: establish a beachhead, secure key infrastructure, mop up a broken, terrified populace. A standard pacification procedure, perfected across a dozen conquered worlds. They expected organized armies. They expected uniforms, clear front lines, and the predictable logic of conventional warfare. Their tactical projections were built on that assumption. They landed in open squares, deployed in textbook-perfect defensive perimeters, and activated their sensor sweeps. The readings that came back made no sense. There were no massed formations, no armored columns moving to engage. The enemy wasn't an army. The enemy was the city itself. Every street became a kill zone. Not from pre-planned defenses, but from 1,000 independent decisions. A window on the third floor of an apartment building slid open. A single shot rang out. A Graxian soldier fell. The window closed. A delivery truck left abandoned in the middle of an intersection suddenly exploded as a patrol passed it. There were no radio transmissions to intercept, no electronic triggers to trace. It was a pressure plate under the asphalt, wired to old mining explosives. They fought house to house, but the houses fought back. They would clear a building room by room, only to have the staircase collapse behind them, trapping them inside. Booby traps were everywhere. Simple, brutal, effective. Tripwires connected to fragmentation charges. Kitchen appliances rigged to explode. The coordination was the most baffling part. There were no centralized commands crackling over the airwaves. Instead, the resistance spoke in a language the Graxians couldn't hear. a series of hand signals from a rooftop across the street. The specific rhythm of a hammer striking metal in a workshop echoing down an alley. The call of a bird that wasn't native to the region, repeated from 3 different directions. A melody played on a slightly out-of-tune piano from an open window. A specific sequence of notes that meant a patrol was turning the corner. The very terrain they sought to conquer, the asphalt, the brick, the alleyways, the ambient sound, became a weaponized entity, an active ally of the defenders. Their casualties mounted, not in grand set-piece battles with clear victories and defeats. They were bled dry in 1,000 petty, brutal skirmishes that had no beginning and no end. They would secure a city square at noon, raising their banner over the central monument. By nightfall, they would still be there, but their numbers would be halved. Picked off by snipers they never saw, whittled down by ambushes from streets they had already declared secure. They held the ground, but the ground was killing them. This was not war as the Graxian military understood it. There was no headquarters to bomb, no general to capture, no supply line to cut. The command structure was distributed, horizontal, democratic. A retired mechanic with knowledge of electrical systems could disable a patrol vehicle. A teenager with a slingshot and a homemade incendiary could force a dropship to alter its landing approach. A grandmother watching from her balcony could signal the movements of troops down below with her window curtain. Every civilian was a potential combatant. Every combatant was a commander of their own tiny piece of the war. The conflict had irrevocably shifted. The Graxians owned the sky, but the humans owned the ground, and the ground was a living, breathing, hostile environment. Orbital dominance was a theory. The reality was a grinding, exhausting struggle where human adaptability and an intimate generational knowledge of their own home terrain proved to be an overwhelming and utterly unquantifiable force. They weren't losing a war. They were being consumed by one. Graxian electronic warfare units were baffled. Their entire purpose was to intercept and disrupt military encryption and standard communication protocols. Their systems were masters of breaking codes, hijacking signals, turning an enemy's own networks against them. They were designed for a clean digital battlefield. What they found on Earth was not clean. It was not digital in any way they understood. They could not crack the codes humanity was using because they were not codes. They weren't even signals in the conventional sense. The coordination was happening in plain sight, hidden inside the noise of daily life. Their sophisticated scanners and decryption suites swept the electromagnetic spectrum and found nothing but the expected chaos of a primitive species. Static, background chatter, the irrelevant hum of a planet going about its business. Their systems dismissed it all as worthless data. Humanity was using its culture as a cryptographic system. It was a form of communication their technology was blind to. A series of specific flute notes played by a child on a rooftop meant an ambush was set 2 blocks east. A modified toy car left on a corner, its wheels pointed in a certain direction, signaled the number of soldiers in a patrol. A pattern of dog barks coordinated across a neighborhood indicated the direction of a troop movement. A specific quilt hung from a laundry line could mark a safe house. The ringing of a particular church bell at an odd hour could be a warning to clear the streets. This network was woven into the fabric of everything: art, music, the behavior of domesticated animals, the routines of daily life. It was steganography on a planetary scale, concealing critical messages within the seemingly innocuous. The Graxian systems were looking for complex digital handshakes, encrypted data packets, and military-grade frequencies. They were not programmed to analyze the melody of a folk song for tactical data. They could not parse the significance of a street performer's specific drum pattern. They saw a child playing with a toy and registered only a child playing with a toy. Their sensors interpreted a farmer whistling to his dog as agricultural background noise. This cultural touchstone network was unjammable. You cannot jam a hand signal. You cannot block a quilt pattern. It was untraceable. There was no signal origin to triangulate, no transmitter to locate. A message could begin with a flash of a mirror in a high window, be relayed by the pitch of a tea kettle whistling in a kitchen, and be confirmed by the arrangement of flowers in a vase on a balcony. It was utterly unpredictable. The rules changed from city to city, from neighborhood to neighborhood. The signal for all clear in one district was the signal for danger in the next. The Graxians were not fighting a military with a command structure. They were fighting a planet's entire history of communication. They were up against generations of folklore, local customs, children's games, and artistic traditions, all suddenly repurposed into a lethal coordination tool. Their electronic warfare was the most advanced in the sector, and it was completely useless. It was like trying to stop the wind by shouting at it. The resolution was a total blunting of their technological edge. Their greatest advantage in every previous conquest, the ability to see and control the battlefield through the electromagnetic spectrum, was nullified. They were deaf and blind in a world that was talking, singing, and signaling all around them. They owned the airwaves, but the messages were moving through the bricks and the trees and the people. Their sophisticated jamming techniques flooded the air with static, and in response, the humans simply switched to using drums. A new alert flashed across the Graxian command deck. A patrol ship on the perimeter was reporting an energy signature. The reading was familiar, but its location was wrong. The system identified it clearly. It was the unmistakable power spike and particle trail of a Graxian medium-yield plasma cannon, standard issue for their infantry support units, but the source coordinates placed it on the surface of Earth. Not from a downed ship, not a damaged weapon. It was a fired shot, an active weapon being used from the ground. Humans had not just resisted. They had salvaged. Wreckage from downed fighters and troop transports was not being collected for study in some secure laboratory. It was being stripped, analyzed, and reassembled in workshops, garages, and underground facilities across the planet. The speed was terrifying. They weren't just copying the technology. They were understanding its principles, then rebuilding it with a brutal, functional simplicity. Their versions were crude, overpowered, lacking the elegant efficiency of Graxian engineering. But they worked. A plasma cannon wired into the municipal power grid of a suburban neighborhood fired again. This time it clipped the wing of the patrol ship that had detected it. Then the attacks began in earnest. Not isolated shots from the ground. Planetary-scale assaults, crude ballistic missiles, relics of old human conflicts lifted from hidden silos. But their guidance systems were new. Scanners showed the telltale energy signature of salvaged Graxian targeting computers, grafted onto the archaic weaponry. The missiles were dumb, but their eyes were smart. They couldn't be fooled by simple countermeasures. A new alert. From the oceans, submarines the Graxians had thought were blind, their sensors useless against Graxian stealth technology. Suddenly acquired targets. They launched. The torpedoes that sped toward the fleet were not armed with conventional explosives. Their warheads glowed with the same unstable blue energy as the plasma cannon. They had taken the power core from a crashed fighter, scaled it up, and sealed it inside a metal tube. It was a horrifyingly simple weapon. A bomb wrapped around a star. On the command deck, shields failed. The energy readings were off the scale. Their own defensive systems were calibrated to absorb and dissipate the precise frequency and yield of standard Graxian weaponry. These human versions were different, rougher, more powerful, less controlled. They overloaded the emitters. Hulls breached. A frigate on the flank took a direct hit from one of the repurposed missiles. The explosion wasn't chemical. It was a miniature sun blossoming against the dark hull, eating through the armor in seconds. The upper hand was not just gone. It had been seized, studied, and turned completely around. Their technological dominance, the foundation of their entire invasion strategy, was now their greatest vulnerability. Every piece of wreckage that fell to Earth was a gift, a lesson, a new weapon for the enemy. Their own science was being used as a club against them. The humans didn't just learn, they implemented. They took a concept, understood its core function, and built a working version before the Graxian tactical analysts could even draft a report on the potential risk. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. The confidence on the command deck evaporated. To see your own most advanced weapons systems, the product of centuries of research and development, firing back at you from the surface of a world you were supposed to have conquered weeks ago, it was a demoralizing shock. It wasn't just a battle loss. It was a complete inversion of the natural order. The teacher was being schooled. The hunter was being hunted with his own rifle. Humanity's capacity to absorb, understand, and repurpose alien technology accelerated far beyond the attacker's most pessimistic strategic planning. This wasn't a matter of technical skill alone. It was a testament to a deeper, more frightening trait, a species-wide collaborative ingenuity that activated under extreme pressure. They weren't just fighting a war. They were conducting the fastest arms race in history, And they were winning it using raw materials scavenged from their opponent's own losses. The battlefield had become a classroom, and the humans were the only ones paying attention. Dr. Patel reappeared on the main view screen. The background was different this time. Not a simple desk in a quiet room. She stood in the center of a command hub, a vast, multi-level chamber buzzing with activity. Screens glowed with tactical data. People moved with purpose behind her, their voices a low hum of coordinated effort. This was not a plea for a hearing. This was a transmission from the heart of the war machine humanity had built in a matter of weeks. She did not ask for terms. She did not request a ceasefire. The time for requests was over. Her tone was flat, devoid of the fiery defiance they might have expected. It was the cold, dispassionate assessment of an engineer stating a structural flaw. You thought we would surrender. A simple declaration of fact. You were wrong. There was no gloating in her voice. No pride, it was merely a correction. A recalibration of their fundamental misunderstanding. She was informing them of a reality they had failed to see, like a teacher pointing out an error in a student's basic arithmetic. Consider this a warning. The words hung in the air on the Graxian command deck. A warning. They were the invaders. They held orbital supremacy. They were the ones who issued warnings. This was a complete inversion of protocol, of the natural order of conquest. She continued, her voice never rising, never falling. Earth is not yours to take. We will defend our home against any threat, no matter how powerful. It was not a boast. It was a statement of policy, as immutable as a law of physics. Then she delivered the line that fractured the remaining confidence in the room. The sentence that rewrote the entire script of the invasion. You have 24 hours to clear our solar system. Silence. The officers on the deck stared at the screen. The invaded were giving the invaders a deadline for withdrawal. They were being issued an ultimatum. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it was like a physical blow. The narrative, carefully constructed over centuries of Graxian expansion, flipped entirely in a single 30-second transmission. They were no longer the hunters. The script had been torn up. The roles were reversed. They were the quarry now. They were the ones being told to leave. The power dynamic, which had seemed so absolute from high orbit, was now a confused and tangled mess. The fleet that had arrived to demand unconditional surrender was now being given a conditional order to vacate the premises. The psychological impact was deeper than any plasma burst. It was an attack on their entire concept of how the universe worked. Superior forces issued demands. Inferior forces complied. This was not compliance. This was a counteroffer they had never imagined receiving. The resolution was a total reframing of the conflict. Human defiance had evolved. It was no longer a desperate defensive campaign, a series of reactions to Graxian moves. This was an active, strategic warning. An assertion of control? They were setting the agenda now. They were defining the terms of engagement. The clock was ticking, but it was their clock. They had taken the initiative and handed the Graxians a problem, with no clear solution in their tactical manuals. Do they comply and lose face in a way no imperial power ever has? Do they refuse and face an enemy that has already proven it can turn their own weapons against them? The choice was no longer about how to conquer Earth. It was about how to survive the consequences of having tried. The data stream reached the Graxian High Council. It wasn't the victory report they expected. The projections were catastrophic. Loss estimates, resource depletion timelines, casualty figures, all of it painted a picture of a campaign spiraling into unsustainable attrition. The briefing officers stood stiffly, their faces neutral masks, but the silence in the chamber was thick with the weight of a doctrine failing in real time. The old assumptions, the core tenets of their imperial playbook, were being presented not as wisdom, but as a series of critical, cascading errors. The casualty reports were not just numbers on a screen. They were a pattern, an intelligent, adaptive pattern of resistance. Each data point told the same story. A patrol eliminated not by overwhelming force, but by a perfectly timed ambush. A dropship disabled not by a missile battery, but by a power grid overload triggered from a civilian substation. The humans were not just fighting. They were learning. They were evolving their tactics in real time, reacting to Graxian movements not with predetermined strategies, but with improvisational brilliance. Each engagement taught them something new, and they applied the lesson before the next battle began. Supreme Counselor Thras reviewed the footage himself. He watched the recordings from the ground, not the sanitized tactical summaries but the raw feeds, the view of a city street where coordination happened through hand signals and musical notes. The sensor logs showing human engineers reassembling a Graxian plasma core with what looked like construction tools. The steady, defiant face of Dr. Patel issuing an ultimatum to a fleet in orbit. He leaned back from the display. This was not the profile of a primitive species to be crushed. The chaos they had first observed was not disorder. It was a different kind of order. A decentralized, resilient, terrifyingly efficient system. This was the profile of a potential peer. Or worse, a potential existential risk if fully awakened and antagonized. The debate in the council chamber shifted instantly. It was no longer a discussion of how to win. The projections made that clear. Victory, if even possible, would cost more than the planet was worth. It would bleed the fleet dry. The question became how to avoid a total loss, how to extricate themselves from a conflict that was consuming resources and ships at an alarming rate, how to retreat without inviting further retaliation from an enemy that had just proven it could punch far above its weight. The core question hanging in the air was simple and horrifying. What have we awakened? They had come to subjugate a divided, backward world. They had instead found a single unified intelligence, a planetary mind capable of rapid technological absorption and ruthless, innovative warfare. Their imperial premise, that technological superiority and overwhelming force guaranteed submission, was a broken tool. It did not work on a species that saw force as a puzzle to be solved and technology as a language to be learned. The resolution was a quiet, grim acceptance. The Graxian leadership was forced to acknowledge the human capacity for resilience, adaptability, and strategic thinking. This was not a rebellion. It was the emergence of a new power. They had to reevaluate everything. Their intelligence was wrong. Their doctrine was wrong. Their entire understanding of power dynamics in the galaxy was suddenly, violently obsolete. The council members looked at each other. No longer conquerors planning a victory parade, but admirals staring at the map of a war they could not afford to continue. The reckoning was not just about a single failed invasion. It was about the future of their empire. A new transmission arrived from Earth. This one was different. It carried a High Council-only encryption, a priority flag that bypassed all standard command channels. It wasn't a military communique. There was no list of demands, no tactical data, no battlefield footage. The file contained two things: a complete human genetic sequence, and a historical record that contradicted everything in the Graxian archives. Dr. Patel appeared on the private view screen in the council chamber. A man stood beside her, introduced as a leading human geneticist. They did not look like diplomats pleading for mercy. They looked like researchers presenting an inconvenient discovery. Their tone was academic, clinical. The data they stated was irrefutable. The geneticist began with a simple spiral model of human DNA. He highlighted specific markers, non-coding sequences that showed a clear, artificial signature. They were not natural mutations. They were insertions, deliberate, sophisticated edits to the genome. Your ancestors engineered early humans, Dr. Patel stated, her voice flat, devoid of accusation. It was a statement of fact. They did so as weapons in a war against an enemy you have erased from your official history. The council chamber was silent. The geneticist zoomed in on the markers. They were approximately 20,000 years old. They were dormant cognitive enhancements, latent functions designed to remain inactive until triggered by a specific set of conditions. The hypothesis was clear. Under extreme species-wide stress, these enhancements activate. This was the explanation. It wasn't just human spirit or determination. It was a switch, flipped by the existential threat of the Graxian invasion. The explosive adaptability, the impossible speed of tech absorption, the cohesive, strategic resilience that defied all their models. It was all written in the code. A programmed response to annihilation. The Graxians had not stumbled upon a primitive world. They had come home. They had returned to a weapon they had built, used, and then abandoned, leaving it to develop on a remote planet, forgotten by the empire that created it. The weapon had not remained a simple tool. Over millennia, it had developed consciousness. It had built culture, art, philosophy, It had developed a will of its own. It had evolved far beyond its original specifications, becoming something its creators could never have anticipated. The invasion was not a conquest. It was a stress test. And humanity had passed with flying colors, activating the very protocols the ancient Graxians had designed to make them the ultimate survivors. The resolution was a devastating historical twist that reframed the entire conflict. This was not a war between strangers. It was a familial conflict. A creator confronting its creation, a tool turning on its maker, the latent potential they had witnessed, the ruthless ingenuity, the collaborative problem-solving, the sheer refusal to break, was not an emergent property of a primitive species. It was a design feature. They had come to conquer a planet and had instead awakened a sleeping weapon, one that recognized its makers not as gods, but as a threat to its existence. The ground had shifted beneath their feet. The moral high ground was gone. The strategic advantage was irrelevant. They were looking at their own handiwork, and it was pointing a gun back at them. The next transmission carried a different tone. It was not from a commander. It was from a diplomat. The shift was deliberate, a clear signal that the nature of the conversation had changed. The view screen resolved on a man standing in a quiet, formal room. Cap Ward. He was introduced as the lead negotiator for a fully united Earth. His demeanor was calm. His posture was open. But his eyes held the same unwavering certainty they had seen in Dr. Patel. He did not open with a threat. He did not repeat the ultimatum. The offer on the table was not surrender. It was terms. He outlined a future the Graxian Council had not considered, a concept their imperial doctrine had no framework for. Partnership, not vassalage. Not a protectorate. A collaborative alliance between two sovereign powers. He laid it out in clear, pragmatic steps. A formal treaty of non-aggression, to be followed by a phased program of cultural and scientific exchange, then contingent on mutual trust and benefit. A limited sharing of technology. The final long-term objective was a full military and economic alliance. A coalition. It was a structured, stepwise process built entirely on the principle of mutual benefit, not subjugation. The humans were not pleading. Their position was not one of weakness. They were negotiating from a position of revealed strength. They had the data from the genetic revelation. They had the tactical reports from the ground war. They had the evidence of their own rapid technological reversal. They knew exactly what they were, and they knew what the Graxians now understood them to be. This was not a request for mercy. It was an offer, a lifeline thrown to an empire that was suddenly, dangerously out of its depth. They were offering the Graxians a clear, strategic way out of a disastrous war, a path that led not to humiliation, but to a stable, powerful coalition. It was a chance to turn a catastrophic miscalculation into a strategic advantage. The alternative was made explicitly clear. Though Ward's tone never became threatening, it remained that of a man stating obvious facts. Continued conflict with a weapon that now knew its own origin. A war against an enemy that understood its own capabilities and its creator's vulnerabilities in a way no external foe ever could. It was a fight the Graxians could not win without suffering losses that would cripple the Empire for generations. The leadership in the council chamber understood the calculus immediately. This was not mercy. This was not a generous offer from a magnanimous victor. It was strategic pragmatism of the highest order. The humans were thinking 3 moves ahead. They saw the bigger picture. They saw the value in a powerful ally instead of a crippled enemy. They saw the resource drain of a forever war, and chose a path of mutual growth instead. The proposal was so alien to the Graxian mindset of conquest and dominance that it took a moment to process. They were being offered a seat at a table, not a place in a chain of command. The resolution was a complete ideological challenge. Humanity was presenting a vision of interstellar relations built on cooperation, exchange, and shared security. It stood in stark, almost blinding contrast to the Graxian conquest ideology that had fueled their expansion for 1,000 years. This was not about crushing an opponent. It was about building something new with them. The offer hung in the air, a complex web of possibility that forced the Empire to look in a mirror and question its own reflection. The path of destruction was clear. The path of partnership was untrodden, risky, and utterly compelling. The next move was theirs, but the board had been completely redesigned. Cap Ward's transmission ended, But the data stream did not terminate. A final packet arrived. It unfolded on the main view screen in the council chamber, not as a message but as an object. A star map. The cartography was precise, detailed, but the region it displayed was a void in the Graxian astral archives. A patch of deep space their long-range scouts had labeled as empty, inert, of no strategic value. It was not empty now. The human map overlaid the black with new data. Energy signatures bloomed across the screen like wounds in the fabric of space. They were immense, ancient. The power readings were off the scale, matching no known technology in the Graxian database or any other. The patterns were wrong. The frequencies were alien. It was a force of a magnitude that redefined their understanding of power in the galaxy. Ward's voice returned, calm, as if he were a historian delivering a difficult lesson. This is the force that drove your ancestors from old Graia. The words landed in the silent chamber with the weight of a planet cracking. Old Graia. The name was a myth. A legend of a first homeworld lost to time. Its fate scrubbed from the official records, its memory reduced to children's stories. The enemy that had broken the founding empire was not a story. It was a fact, and the humans had the data to prove it. The enemy their own history had been engineered to forget was not gone. It was out there, and it was moving. The humans had not just looked inward, unraveling the genetic code the ancient Graxians had left inside them. They had looked outward. With telescopes built for science and probes sent on missions of peace, they had scanned the deep black, and they had found something the mighty Graxian Empire, with its war fleets and conquests, had either missed or deliberately ignored. The footage showed long-range sensor logs, blurry but unmistakable, vast non-biological structures moving in the dark between galaxies, a fleet or a single entity of impossible scale on a direct heading. Its trajectory was not random. It was purposeful. And it was approaching. The conflict between Graxian and human, which had moments before seemed like the most important struggle in the galaxy, was suddenly reframed. It was a familial squabble, a bitter argument between a creator and its creation. It was a petty drama played out on a single world, insignificant against the backdrop of what was coming. The choice was no longer a simple binary of conquest or diplomacy. It was not about who would rule Earth. The new choice was existential. It was about who would survive. The option was no longer victory or defeat. It was facing oblivion alone or facing it together. The resolution was a cold, hard injection of reality into the Council's strategic calculations. Earth had just shared the most chilling intelligence any Graxian had ever seen. They weren't just offering an alliance. They were presenting evidence of a shared extinction event. The ancient threat, the original nightmare that had shattered their first empire, was returning. And it was coming for them all. The humans and Graxians were no longer opposing forces on a battlefield. They were two species standing on the same shore, watching the same tidal wave rise on the horizon. The proposal of partnership was no longer just a strategic alternative to war. It was the only possible recipe for mutual survival. The debate was over. The context for every decision had just been violently and permanently expanded. The High Council was silent. The data on the view screen was undeniable. The genetic markers, the star map with its ancient approaching threat, the casualty reports from a ground war that was consuming their fleet. The numbers were not projections anymore. They were facts. The choice was no longer abstract. It was a binary switch: save face and cling to a failed conquest. A doctrine that was breaking in their hands, or adapt, change, survive. The old imperial model, the belief in shock, awe, and immediate capitulation was shattered. It was a broken tool. It could not process an enemy that became an ally mid-invasion. The system had no protocol for this. Supreme Counselor Thras watched the data stream. He saw the projections for continued engagement, the resource depletion, the ship losses. Then he looked at the human offer. The map of the ancient enemy. He made the calculation. It was not a difficult one. Survival outweighed tradition. Pride was a luxury they could not afford. The humans had outmaneuvered them completely. Not just on the battlefield with their salvaged tech and cultural warfare, not just in orbit with their impossible resilience. They had outmaneuvered them strategically, diplomatically. They had presented a problem with no solution except the one they offered. Their emergent coalition was the key. This Earth Emergency Response Coalition was not a temporary government. It was the kernel of something new. It had united a fractured planet in hours. It was already forming bonds with other species on the periphery of Graxian space, species the Empire had bullied or ignored. This human-led network was growing, adapting, evolving at a pace that far outpaced anything in the Graxian projection models. It was organic. It was unpredictable. It was powerful. To continue the invasion was to fight a two-front war of an impossible nature. On one front, a resilient, adaptive enemy on the ground, an enemy that was now using their own technology against them. On the second front, an ancient, existential terror of unknown power approaching from the void. It was a war they could not win. The cost would be the Empire itself. To accept the human offer was to gain a partner. A formidable, unsettling, unpredictable partner, but a partner nonetheless. It was to face the coming storm with an ally who had already proven it could survive impossible odds. The old dynamic was dead. The bully versus victim script was torn up and thrown out an airlock. That story was over. The new future offered only two paths: partnership or mutual destruction. There was no third option, no glorious conquest, no negotiated surrender. The humans were not asking to surrender. They were offering an alliance. The Graxians were not being asked to be overlords. They were being asked to be participants. It was a humbling, terrifying, and utterly necessary recalibration of their place in the universe. The resolution was a quiet order, spoken into the heavy air of the council chamber. The invasion was terminated. All offensive operations were to cease immediately. The fleet was to assume a defensive, non-hostile posture. The command was sent. Across the fleet, officers looked at their consoles. The change in status was not a retreat. It was a pivot, a fundamental shift in intent. The Graxian Empire, for the first time in its recorded history, abandoned a conquest for diplomacy. They stood down. They recognized the human emergent coalition not as a target to be destroyed, but as a strategic peer to be engaged. The calculation was cold. The logic was flawless. They had come to subjugate a world. They would leave having acknowledged a new power, a new image resolved on the view screens across both fleets. Not a transmission from a command center or a lone diplomat. This was a shared feed. Two figures stood side by side, a study in contrast against a plain background. Cap Ward, human, his expression calm and open, and beside him, emissary Scar of the Graxian Empire, his posture stiff, his features unreadable to a human eye, but his positioning spoke volumes. They stood together, a unified front. The context had shifted entirely. The language of war was gone. The airwaves, once filled with surrender demands and ultimatums, now carried a different kind of signal. The statement began. It was not a list of demands. It was not a negotiation. It was an invitation. Ward spoke first, his voice level. The offer was extended directly, clearly to the entire Graxian Empire. An invitation to join, not to submit, not to obey, to join a broader coalition, an alliance that was already forming in the aftermath of the invasion. Earth was its heart, but its doors were open. The invitation leveraged the mutual history, however fraught and violent it had been. It acknowledged the conflict as a brutal, costly, but ultimately informative stress test. It recognized the alliance's growing strength not as a threat but as an opportunity. The roles were clearly, if silently, defined. The humans were the architects of this new structure. They had laid the foundation, drawn the blueprints, and issued the call. They were not subordinates in an empire. They were the builders of a new system. The Graxians were not overlords being petitioned. They were participants. They were being offered a seat at a table they had not built, to discuss a future they had not envisioned. It was a humbling proposition. It required them to set aside millennia of imperial doctrine and engage as equals, or perhaps even as junior partners in a venture whose rules they did not yet understand. Then the visual proof followed. The shared feed split. It showed the orbital space above Earth. The angular, predatory shapes of Graxian warships held their positions, but now moving among them were new forms. Blocky, utilitarian, inelegant human designs, ships built from salvaged Graxian tech and old Earth alloys, patched together with a brutal functional simplicity. They were crude. They were powerful. They did not match the graceful lines of the Imperial fleet. The two fleets began to intermingle. Not merging, not yet. They oriented toward a common heading, a mix of forms and functions, a joint force. It was an awkward fusion, a tense and necessary combination of two technologies, two philosophies, two histories that had just been trying to destroy each other. Neither side could predict this future. The Graxian officers on their command decks looked at the blocky human ships on their scopes, trying to calculate their capabilities, their weaknesses, their value. The human commanders in their salvaged cockpits looked at the sleek Graxian cruisers, understanding their power, but also their newfound fragility. They were allies by necessity, bound by a shared threat and a mutual discovery that had rewritten their pasts. They did not trust each other. They did not like each other. But they needed each other. They could only face what was coming together. The resolution was a pivotal, quiet turning point in the history of both species. The Graxian Empire, a monolithic power built on conquest and dominance, had agreed to a dramatic, unthinkable shift. They had abandoned the path of invasion for the uncertain road of diplomacy. They had accepted an invitation to join a human-led coalition. The transmission ended. The two figures vanished from the screen, but the new formation in orbit remained, a silent, tangible testament to a choice that had been made. The war was over. The real work was just beginning. The story does not end with peace. It opens onto a larger war. The truce between human and Graxian is not a conclusion. It is a prelude, a necessary alliance forged in the heat of a smaller conflict, now facing a darkness that makes their squabble over a single planet look like a petty argument. The immediate threat is gone. The real threat is still coming. On a new joint command view screen, Earth's diplomats and Graxian commanders look at the same star map, the same chilling data. The ancient enemy is out there. Its trajectory is clear, a line cutting through the void toward populated space. Its power is unknown. The sensor readings are off the scale, defying classification. It moves with a purpose that feels old and cold and utterly alien. This is not an invasion fleet. It is something else. A force of nature with intent. The galaxy is no longer a playground for empire. The Graxian dream of endless conquest is dead. The human dream of isolated safety is dead. The reality is a field of dangerous enemies and potential allies. A landscape where survival is no longer guaranteed by superior firepower or hidden genetic codes. It will require new forms of unity, strategies that have never been written, ways of thinking that blend two completely alien psychologies into a single, functional command. The human capacity for improvisation must fuse with the Graxian capacity for discipline. The chaotic, adaptive, democratic resistance that bled the invaders white must learn to operate within the framework of a structured, hierarchical fleet. The Graxian military machine, built for overwhelming force and precise execution, must learn to bend, to improvise, to accept a plan that changes minute by minute. This fusion will be messy. It will be filled with friction and misunderstanding. It is their only chance. They embark toward this joint future. The mixed fleet orients itself. Angular Graxian warships move in formation, their movements precise and calculated. Among them, the blocky, salvaged human designs fly in a looser, more reactive pattern. They are an awkward armada, a tense and unprecedented combination. They are aware, every officer on every bridge, that the easy days are over. The simple calculus of conqueror and conquered is gone. The future is complex, uncertain. The real test of both civilizations is not behind them. It is directly ahead. Cap Ward stands on the observation deck of the lead human vessel. He watches the fleet assemble through the thick glass. The scale of it is staggering, the product of a war that lasted weeks and a decision that took minutes. He turns to the Graxian emissary standing beside him, the silence between them heavy with the weight of shared history and shared dread. He doesn't smile. His expression is grim, practical, accepting of the brutal task ahead. He speaks quietly, almost to himself, the words a dry, understated acknowledgement of the impossible situation they have built together. I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. The narrative closes on this two-front horizon. The immediate conflict with the Graxians is resolved, but it was only the first skirmish. The real war is coming. Humans and Graxians, creator and creation, stand together not as friends but as partners in survival. They are preparing to confront an ancient foe that threatens them both. A shadow from a past the Graxians tried to erase, and a future the humans must now help shape. The core message is not one of victory, but of resilience and cooperation forged in the face of a universe that is far darker and more dangerous than either species ever imagined alone. The story ends where the next one begins. The Graxian conquest briefing is now a case study in miscalculation. They measured strength in concrete terms: warship count, shield density, total firepower. They quantified power, cataloged it, and assumed the numbers would speak for themselves. Their entire doctrine was a spreadsheet of superiority. They arrived with the biggest fleet, the best technology, and the certainty that these things were the only variables in the equation of conquest. They were wrong. The numbers were a lie. Humanity redefined strength. They proved it wasn't a quantity you could measure on a sensor display. It was a quality. It was unity, forged in minutes under the pressure of an existential threat. It was adaptability, the ability to learn and change and improvise at a speed that left their opponents baffled. It was the will to survive, a stubborn, species-wide refusal to accept an endpoint. They had no single superweapon. Their weapon was their collective mind, and it was a system the Graxians couldn't target, couldn't jam, and couldn't understand. The outcome of the conflict was not determined by who had the better technology. It was determined by who could learn faster. The Graxians operated from a fixed playbook, a doctrine honed over centuries of fighting enemies who fought by similar rules. The humans had no playbook. They wrote a new one every hour. They learned from every engagement, every scrap of wreckage, every failed Graxian tactic. They treated the invasion not as a war, but as a problem to be solved, and they were very, very good at solving problems. The ordeal of the invasion was a forge. It took a divided, fractious planet and hammered it into a single, cohesive entity. The heat and pressure revealed a latent potential that was hidden in their very DNA. A programmed response to extinction that even they didn't know they possessed. They weren't just fighting for their lives. They were fulfilling a design purpose that was tens of thousands of years old, but they were doing it on their own terms. They were a weapon, but they had chosen what to fight for. The reward was not just survival. It was a new understanding of their own place in the universe. They discovered they were not merely victims or rebels fighting against an oppressor. They were heirs to a designed purpose, but they had transcended it. They were supposed to be a tool. They had become something more. They had developed consciousness, culture, and a will of their own. They were a created thing that had created itself anew, and they offered that transcended purpose not as a threat, but as the foundation for an alliance. They didn't try to destroy their creators. They didn't seek revenge. They saw the bigger picture. They saw the common ground in their shared manufactured origin and the shared threat on the horizon. They took the very thing that made them dangerous and offered it as the basis for cooperation. It was the ultimate act of redefinition. In the end, the dragon was not slain. There was no glorious final battle where the monster was vanquished. Instead, the dragon was shown a reflection of itself. The Graxians saw their own arrogance, their own limited view of power, reflected back at them in the defiant, intelligent resistance of their own creation. And they were offered a chance to change, to be something more than conquerors, to be partners. The hero's journey culminates here, not in a victory parade, but in a quiet, collective discovery. The humans learned that true strength lies in resilience, not in armor, in ingenuity, not in raw power, in cooperation, not in domination. They redefined power for themselves, and in doing so, they forced the Graxians to redefine it as well. Both species looked into the abyss, and then they looked at each other, and they understood that the old definitions were useless. The future would require a new kind of strength, and they would have to build it together. The view screen goes dark. The story is both a warning and a promise. The universe tests every civilization. It pushes them to their absolute limit. Survival doesn't always go to the strongest. It goes to the most adaptable. The lesson is clear. Resilience matters more than firepower. Ingenuity matters more than perfect technology. Cooperation matters more than flawless discipline. The definition of strength isn't a fixed point. It's a quality that can be redefined by those willing to learn, to change, and to stand together when it matters most.